In the year 1579, sometime during the long, warm stretch of summer, a tall ship rocked gently against the moorings of a Japanese port town. The wood of the hull had been creaking for months across open water, and now, finally, it settled into a different kind of rhythm. The soft, almost imperceptible bump and sway of a vessel tied to land. The ropes groaned quietly. The water beneath was not the deep indigo of the open ocean anymore, but something shallower, greener, muddied by the silt of the coast. And if you had been standing on that deck, looking out, the first thing you would have noticed was the air. Not the view, not the land itself. The air. It was heavy. It pressed against the skin like something warm and damp had been draped over your shoulders. The humidity of a Japanese summer is a thing unto itself, a thing that does not simply surround you, but seems to settle into your clothes, into the folds of fabric at your elbows and behind your knees. It carries with it a particular scent, one that is difficult to describe precisely, because it is made of so many things layered together. There was the brine of the harbor, of course, the salt and the fish and the wet rope. But underneath that, something green, something vegetal and alive. The hills behind the port were thick with trees, and the moisture in the air pulled the smell of those trees down into the town, mixing cedar and pine with the earthier, sweeter smell of rain-soaked soil. And then, threaded through all of it, the smoke of cooking fires, thin and pale, rising from low wooden structures that lined the waterfront in neat, quiet rows. Standing on that deck, taller than nearly every other figure around him, was a man whose name the historical record would eventually render as Yasuke. He was African, likely from Mozambique, though the precise details of his earliest life remain even now soft and uncertain, like an ink brush stroke that has bled slightly into damp paper. What we do know is that he had traveled an extraordinarily long way to be standing in that humidity. He was an attendant to a man named Alessandro Valignano, an Italian Jesuit, a visitor to the missions of the East, a man of considerable authority within the Society of Jesus. Valignano was tall himself by the standards of the day, but Yasuke was taller still, and broader, and his presence on the deck of that ship, looking out over the low rooftops and the green forested hills of this unfamiliar coastline, must have been a moment of profound and quiet strangeness. Try to imagine it for a moment. The sheer accumulation of distance, the weeks and months aboard ships, the stops at ports along the coasts of Africa, the crossing to Goa in India, the long sojourn through Portuguese territories in the east, and then the final passage across the sea to Japan. Each place would have carried its own particular weight of heat, its own smell, its own color of sky at dusk. And now this. A land of wooden buildings with curved rooftops that swept upward at their edges, like the wings of birds settling down to rest. A land where the trees were impossibly green, where the pathways between buildings were narrow and clean, where the people moved in garments that seemed to flow around their bodies in layers of muted color, slate blue and soft gray, and the undyed beige of raw cotton. Valignano's procession did not linger at the port. There was purpose to this visit, a mission that extended far beyond the waterfront. The Jesuits had been in Japan for some decades already, and Valignano had come to inspect, to organize, to understand the nature of the mission in this complex and fractured country. Japan in 1579 was deep in what historians call the Sengoku period, an era of near-constant conflict between regional lords, each one governing their domain with a mixture of military strength and political cunning. But from the perspective of someone simply walking through the countryside, you might not have known it. The roads between towns were often quiet. The rice paddies stretched out in wide, still mirrors of water, reflecting the pale sky. Farmers moved slowly through the fields, bent at the waist, their straw hats casting round shadows on the water's surface. The procession moved inland, toward the capital, toward Kyoto. And it moved slowly, as all travel did in that era, on foot and by palanquin, along roads that wound through valleys and over low mountain passes. The landscape unfolded with a patience that we, in our present age, can barely comprehend. A single journey of what might now take a few hours by car could stretch across days, and in those days there was nothing to do but observe. The texture of the path beneath your sandals, the way the dust rose in the dry stretches and turned to soft mud where a stream crossed the road, the particular song of insects in the tall grass, a high, continuous hum that seemed to rise and fall with the temperature, louder in the heat of the afternoon, softer as the shadows lengthened. Yasuke walked through all of this. He saw the thatched roofs of farmhouses, the dark wood of their walls, the small gardens where vegetables grew in tidy rows. He saw the way that water was everywhere in this country, not just in the rivers and the paddies, but in the very air, condensing on surfaces in the cool of the morning, dripping from the eaves of buildings, pooling in the curved tiles of rooftops after a sudden rain. Japan in summer is a country that seems perpetually damp, and the wood of its buildings absorbs that dampness and darkens with it, giving everything a rich, deep tone, the color of old tea. And then there were the people. As the procession moved closer to more populated areas, the people began to gather. Word, it seems, traveled faster than the procession itself. A tall foreigner, taller than any man most of these villagers and townspeople had ever seen, with skin darker than anything in their experience, was walking through their province. The crowds did not rush. They assembled slowly, lining the edges of the road, standing in doorways, peering from behind wooden fences. From Yasuke's perspective, looking out over the heads of the Jesuit entourage, it must have appeared as a kind of sea. A sea of faces, dark-haired and quiet-eyed, watching with an intensity that was not aggressive, but deeply, almost reverently, curious. Children stood half-hidden behind their mothers. Old men leaned on walking sticks and squinted. Young women held their sleeves to their faces, a gesture of modesty, or perhaps simply of wonder. And the sound of it was not what you might expect of a crowd. There was murmuring. Yes, a low and continuous ripple of voices, but it was restrained. The Japanese social order of that time placed great value on composure, on the quiet observation of things, before any outward reaction. And so the crowd watched, and Yasuke moved through them like a stone, moving slowly through still water, the ripples of attention spreading outward in gentle concentric rings. Valignano, for his part, was accustomed to attention, though perhaps not of this particular kind. He walked with the measured pace of a man who understood the importance of presentation, his black Jesuit robes stark against the muted colors of the Japanese landscape. The other members of the Jesuit party moved alongside him, some Japanese converts, some fellow Europeans, all of them dwarfed in the public eye by the figure of Yasuke. It is worth pausing here to note that Yasuke's role in this procession was not that of a spectacle. He was an attendant. He carried out duties. He was part of the functioning structure of Valignano's household. But history and the eyes of the crowd assigned him a different kind of visibility, one that he could neither control nor refuse. The days passed. The procession moved through towns whose names blurred together in the historical record, each one a collection of wooden buildings and narrow streets, and the ever-present smell of damp cedar. The nights were spent in temples, or in the homes of local Christians who had converted under the Jesuits' earlier efforts. The futons were laid out on tatami mats, those tightly woven straw floor coverings that give slightly under the body's weight and carry a faint grassy smell, a clean and simple smell that fills a room when the air is still. The sliding doors, made of wooden frames and translucent paper, let in the faintest glow of moonlight, and the sound of crickets outside was so constant and so even that it became a kind of silence in itself. And then, after many days of this slow, deliberate travel, the procession reached Kyoto. The city was larger than anything on the road had suggested. It spread out across a wide valley, its streets laid in a grid, its temples and residences rising in tiers of dark wood and white plaster. Somewhere within this city was the residence of a man whose name was spoken with a particular weight, a particular gravity. Oda Nobunaga. He was, at that time, the most powerful warlord in Japan, a man who had through years of military and political effort brought a significant portion of the country under his control. And it was to him that Valignano sought an audience. The procession came to a stop before a gate. It was massive, built of heavy timber, its surface darkened by weather and age, its crossbeams thick enough to sit upon. Above it, the curved roofline of the residence swept upward against a pale, humid sky. There were guards, standing still and silent in their armor, watching. And the procession waited. The air was warm. The insects hummed. Somewhere inside, behind those heavy walls, decisions were being made. And Yasuke stood in the heat, the 2,000-mile journey settling into the stillness of his legs, and he looked up at the gate, and he waited. The gate opened slowly, not with a dramatic sweep, but with the low, deliberate groan of heavy timber pivoting on iron fittings that had been oiled but could not be made entirely silent. The sound was deep and resonant, the kind of sound you feel in your chest before you fully register it in your ears. And beyond the gate, a courtyard opened up, wide and raked with pale gravel, each tiny stone combed into long, parallel lines that curved gently around the bases of a few carefully placed rocks. The gravel crunched softly underfoot, a quiet, grinding whisper, as the Jesuit party was led forward by attendants who moved with the particular economy of motion that seemed, to foreign eyes, to be a defining quality of Japanese service. No wasted gesture, no hurried step. Each movement deliberate, measured, as though the act of walking across a courtyard were itself a thing worthy of care. It was the spring of 1581. Nearly 2 years had passed since that first arrival at the port. 2 years during which Valignano and his entourage had traveled through various parts of Japan, visiting missions, meeting converts, cataloging the strange and intricate customs of this island country. And in those 2 years, Yasuke had become something of a quiet legend. Word of the tall, dark-skinned man in the Jesuits' company had spread through the networks of rumor and report that connected the provinces. It had reached, as such things inevitably did, the ears of Oda Nobunaga. And Nobunaga, who was known among many things for an insatiable and almost childlike curiosity about the foreign and the novel, had requested to see him. The party was led through a series of corridors. This is worth dwelling on, because the architecture of a powerful lord's residence in Sengoku-era Japan was not simply a building, it was a language. Each corridor, each turn, each sliding door that was opened by a kneeling servant was a statement about distance and rank and the careful ordering of space. The floors were polished wood, dark and smooth, and they reflected the light that filtered in through paper-covered screens in soft, diffused rectangles. The wood was cool underfoot and utterly silent beneath the cloth-soled footwear of the Japanese attendants, though it gave the faintest creak under the heavier step of the foreigners. The walls were adorned sparingly. A single hanging scroll of calligraphy in one alcove, a spray of flowers, just 3 stems, arranged in a ceramic vessel the color of moss in another. The air smelled of tatami, that gentle, grassy scent, and beneath it the faintest trace of incense, something resinous and old, as though it had been burned hours ago, and its ghost still lingered in the grain of the wood. They walked for what felt like a long time, corridor into corridor, each one slightly wider or slightly more adorned than the last, each transition marked by the soft sound of a sliding door being drawn open, and then, after they had passed, drawn shut behind them. The effect was one of deepening stillness. The sounds of the courtyard, the distant murmur of the city beyond the walls, fell away with each turn, until the silence was almost total, broken only by the rustle of fabric and the occasional soft exhale of breath. And then they arrived at the audience hall. The doors were opened, and the space beyond was vast. The ceiling was high, and supported by thick wooden beams that had been sanded and lacquered to a deep, luminous brown. The tatami mats on the floor stretched out in a great unbroken expanse, their edges bordered with dark fabric, their surface pale gold-green in the ambient light. At the far end of the hall, raised slightly on a platform no more than a few inches high, sat Oda Nobunaga. He was not a large man. The historical descriptions suggest a figure of lean build, sharp-featured, with a thin beard and eyes that carried a particular directness, a quality of looking at things not past them or through them, but precisely, exactly at them. He wore layers of silk, the outermost a deep muted color, perhaps indigo, or the darkest shade of plum, and he sat in a posture of absolute stillness, his hands resting on his thighs, his back straight but not rigid. Around him, retainers sat in rows along the edges of the hall, each one a study in controlled immobility, their swords placed neatly at their sides, the lacquered scabbards catching the light in thin, dull gleams. The Jesuits entered and performed their greetings. Valignano, who had by this time developed a considerable understanding of Japanese protocol, conducted himself with the appropriate depth of bow, the appropriate distance from the raised platform. There were pleasantries, conducted through interpreters, the slow back and forth of translated speech that gave the conversation a rhythm, like breathing, a phrase offered, a pause, the translation murmured, another pause, the reply. But Nobunaga's attention, according to the accounts that survive, was not fixed on Valignano for long. It drifted with an almost gravitational pull toward Yasuke. He stared. The records are clear on this point. Nobunaga looked at Yasuke with a sustained and undisguised fascination. Yasuke stood tall in that hall, his height placing him above every other figure in the room, his skin a deep, rich darkness that was, in the context of that pale, wood and paper world, utterly unlike anything Nobunaga or his retainers had ever seen in the flesh. There had been descriptions, perhaps, paintings on foreign screens, traders' tales from the southern ports. But the reality of it, the sheer physical presence of this man, standing in the soft light of the audience hall, was something else entirely. And then Nobunaga spoke. The words, filtered through centuries of retelling, amounted to a question, or perhaps not quite a question, but an observation framed as disbelief. He suggested, or perhaps stated outright, that Yasuke's skin must have been colored with ink. Black ink, the kind used for calligraphy, brushed or rubbed onto the skin. It was not spoken as an insult. There is no indication of malice in the historical accounts. It was spoken as a man might speak who has encountered something so far outside his experience that his mind reaches for the nearest explanation, however unlikely, simply to have something to hold on to. What followed was a thing of extraordinary quietness. Nobunaga gave an order, and servants came forward. They brought with them a basin of warm water and cloths of rough cotton. The water steamed faintly in the cool air of the hall. Yasuke, by the accounts available to us, did not resist. He understood, or was made to understand, what was being asked. And so he stood, or perhaps knelt, as the servants dampened the cloths and began to rub them against his skin. Against the skin of his arm, most likely, the forearm, where the cloth could be applied, and the result observed clearly. Try to imagine the slowness of this moment. The hall was silent. Every eye in the room was fixed on the small, deliberate motions of the servants' hands. The cloth moved across Yasuke's skin in long, careful strokes, and the warm water ran in thin rivulets down toward his wrist, catching the light as it went. The sound was barely a sound at all, just the soft, wet drag of cotton on skin, the faint drip of water into the basin below, and the skin beneath the cloth remained exactly as it was. Dark, unchanged, unaltered by the water or the friction. The ink, which had never been ink at all, did not wash away. There is something almost meditative about this scene when you allow it to settle. A room full of powerful men, warriors and politicians and scholars, all watching in perfect stillness as warm water is applied to a man's arm. The steam rising, the cloth moving, the quiet drip. And then the realization, spreading through the room, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, dawning comprehension, like the way light enters a room at dawn, not all at once but by degrees, that this was simply his skin, that this darkness was not applied but inherent, that this man was, in the most fundamental and irreducible sense, something Nobunaga had never encountered before. And Nobunaga, to his considerable credit in the historical record, responded not with suspicion or discomfort, but with admiration. The accounts describe something close to delight Here was a novelty of the highest order, a man of immense physical stature and striking appearance, who had traveled from the other side of the world. Nobunaga was a collector of the extraordinary. He kept foreign goods, European firearms, unusual animals, objects, and people that defied the ordinary categories of his world. And Yasuke, standing in that hall, with the water still drying on his arm, became something precious in Nobunaga's estimation. And with that status came the outward marks of it. A name rendered in the sounds of the Japanese language. Yasuke. Whether this was a translation of a name he already carried, or an entirely new appellation given to him in that hall, we cannot say with certainty. But it was his, spoken aloud in that quiet room, and it became the name by which history would remember him. And then the silk. A kimono was brought forward, folded with the meticulous care that attended all things in a lord's household, the fabric smooth and cool to the touch, its weight surprising for something so fluid. It was draped over his shoulders by attendants who reached up to do so, their hands careful, their movements unhurried. The silk settled against his frame, falling in long, straight lines from his broad shoulders, and the weight of it was not the weight of cloth alone. It was the weight of a new name, a new station, a new life, folding itself quietly around him in a country 10,000 miles from wherever he had first drawn breath. And Yasuke stood in that silent hall wearing the silk, and the room was very still, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the tatami mats, and the incense ghosts hung in the air, and he breathed, and the silk moved with him, and that was all. The short sword was presented to him on a morning when the mist had not yet lifted from the lake. Azuchi Castle stood on the shores of Lake Biwa, the largest freshwater lake in Japan, and in the early hours the water and the sky became indistinguishable from one another, a single continuous field of pale gray that seemed to dissolve the boundaries of the world. The castle itself rose above this mist, like something imagined rather than built, its multiple stories climbing upward in a series of sweeping roof lines, each one edged with dark tile that curved upward at the corners. It was Nobunaga's masterpiece, his statement to the world, and on that quiet morning, somewhere within its polished corridors, Yasuke received the blade. The sword was a wakizashi, the shorter of the two blades that together formed the paired set carried by those in service to a lord. It was not the longer katana, not yet, but it was steel and it was real, and the weight of it was the first thing he would have noticed. Not its sharpness, not the gentle curve of its edge, but its weight. A wakizashi is heavier than it appears. The blade itself is dense, forged through a process of repeated folding and hammering that compresses the metal into something extraordinarily solid. And the handle, wrapped tightly in cord over a layer of rayskin, sits in the hand with a particular firmness, a sense of being gripped back. The scabbard was lacquered wood, smooth and dark, and when the blade was seated within it, the whole object carried a muted, self-contained gravity, like a sentence that has been finished but not yet spoken aloud. He would have worn it tucked into the sash at his waist on his left side, the curve of the scabbard following the curve of his hip. And later, when the longer sword was also granted to him, the two together would have created a subtle asymmetry in his silhouette, a visual marker that anyone in that world would have recognized immediately. The paired swords were not merely weapons. They were, in the language of that society, an identity. They said, without any words at all, that the person carrying them had been granted a station, a trust, a place within the ordered hierarchy of a lord's household. And for Yasuke, a man who had arrived in this country as an attendant to a foreign priest, that weight against his hip must have carried a meaning that went far beyond the steel itself. The days at Azuchi Castle settled into a rhythm. This is something that the dramatic retellings of history often overlook. The sheer amount of time that passes in which nothing of particular note occurs. The months of 1581 moved into 1582, and during those months, Yasuke lived. He woke in the early hours, when the light was still thin and blue, in a room that had been assigned to him within the castle compound. The room was modest by the standards of higher-ranking retainers, but extraordinary by any other measure. A space of clean tatami and sliding paper doors, and a single window that looked out over the lower rooftops toward the lake. The tatami smelled faintly of dried grass, and in the mornings, before the heat of the day settled in, the air that came through the window carried the cool mineral scent of the water below. His duties centered on proximity to Nobunaga. He was a weapon-bearer, a man whose role was to be near the Lord, to carry items of martial significance, to stand in attendance during audiences and meals, and the long, idle hours of court life. He held Nobunaga's helmet on occasions of ceremony, a lacquered and decorated object that was surprisingly light for its appearance, its interior padded with cloth that carried the faint human smell of its owner, a trace of sweat and hair oil, and the particular warmth of a living body. He held it cradled in both hands, standing behind and to the side of Nobunaga, and he stood still, and he waited, and the hours passed. Standing guard was the most common of his duties, and it was, in its essence, an exercise in sustained stillness. The corridors of Azuchi Castle were long and polished, the wood of the floors so thoroughly maintained that they reflected the light from the paper screens in soft, blurred shapes. Yasuke would stand at a designated position, his back straight, his hands resting on the hilt of his sword, or folded before him, and he would watch. He watched servants move past in near silence, their cloth-soled feet making no more sound than the brush of a leaf against a stone. He watched the light shift across the floors as the sun moved overhead, the rectangles of illumination cast by the paper screens, sliding imperceptibly from one side of the corridor to the other over the course of an afternoon. He watched dust motes drift in the still air, turning slowly in the light, rising and falling on currents too faint to feel, all against the skin. The humidity was constant. Azuchi, situated near the lake, was wrapped in moisture for much of the year, and in the warmer months this moisture became a presence unto itself, thickening the air, settling into the wood of the castle, drawing out the deeper smells of the building, the cedar of the beams, the lacquer on the railings, the faint sweetness of the tatami. Yasuke's silk garments clung to his skin in the heat, and the swords at his hip grew warm against his body. Sweat gathered at his temples and along the line of his jaw, and dried slowly in the still air of the interior rooms. There were no fans in the corridors, no movement of air, except what came through open screens. And so the heat simply sat, patient and heavy, and Yasuke stood within it, and the hours accumulated like layers of sediment, one upon another, quiet and unremarkable, and deeply, fundamentally real. He observed Nobunaga. This was perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of his daily life, the simple fact of his proximity to one of the most powerful and enigmatic figures in Japanese history. Nobunaga in his private hours was not the fearsome warlord of the battlefield. He was a man who drank tea with a particular attentiveness, holding the bowl in both hands and turning it slowly before drinking. He was a man who appreciated the performance of no theater, that ancient and hypnotic art form, in which masked performers move with glacial slowness across a bare stage, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to belong to a different, slower version of time. He was a man who sometimes laughed abruptly, a sharp and unguarded sound that would break the silence of a room and then vanish, leaving the silence somehow deeper than before. There were moments of eccentricity that the historical accounts hint at without fully elaborating. Nobunaga's fascination with foreign objects, his willingness to wear European clothing on occasion, his delight in firearms, not merely as tools of war, but as mechanical curiosities, the precision of their construction, the ingenuity of their design. He would handle a matchlock arquebus with the same attentive care he brought to a tea bowl, turning it in his hands, examining the mechanism of the trigger and the firing pan with an almost tender focus. And Yasuke, standing nearby, would have watched this. He would have seen the warlord in these unguarded moments of simple curiosity, and perhaps he recognized something in them, some echo of his own experience of encountering a world made entirely of unfamiliar things. The other retainers regarded Yasuke with a mixture of responses that the records do not fully clarify. There must have been curiosity, certainly. Perhaps some measure of resentment from those who had spent years earning their place within the hierarchy, only to see a foreigner granted similar standing. But the accounts that survive do not speak of conflict. They speak, instead of Nobunaga's evident favor, of conversations between the lord and his unusual retainer, conducted through interpreters, or perhaps, as the months passed, in the fragments of Japanese that Yasuke would have inevitably absorbed. A language learned not through study but through immersion, through the daily repetition of commands and courtesies, and the small functional words that make up the texture of shared work. Stand here. Bring that. Yes. Thank you. The vocabulary of service, of presence, of belonging. And belonging is perhaps the most important word in all of this, because for all the strangeness of his situation, for all the immense cultural and geographical distance between his origins and this castle on the shore of a Japanese lake, there is something in the accounts that suggests a kind of settling in, a man finding his rhythm within a new structure. The mornings, the duties, the long, quiet hours, the meals of rice and fish and pickled vegetables, eaten in the retainer's quarters, the chopsticks held carefully in fingers, more accustomed to other implements. The baths, those deep hot soaking tubs that were a central ritual of Japanese daily life, the water almost unbearably warm at first, then slowly, deeply soothing, the heat drawing the tension from muscles that had stood at attention for hours. The evenings, when the castle quieted, and the sounds of the lake, the soft lapping of water against the stone foundations, the distant cry of a night bird, drifted up through the open screens. The months passed in this way. Seasons turned. The humid summer gave way to an autumn of extraordinary color. the maples on the hillsides around the lake flaring into reds and golds so vivid they seemed almost audible. Then winter, cold and clear, the lake steaming in the early mornings, the castle corridors frigid before the braziers were lit. Then spring again, the cherry blossoms appearing on the trees in the courtyards in clusters of pale pink, each petal so thin that the light passed through it, and the petals fell slowly, spiraling downward in the still air, settling on the gravel paths and on the surface of the water in the stone basins, and on the dark fabric of Yasuke's shoulders as he stood at his post. And then it was June of 1582. Nobunaga had traveled to Kyoto, and Yasuke had traveled with him, as was his duty and his place. They were lodged at the Honnoji, a temple in the heart of the city, a compound of wooden buildings and quiet gardens, surrounded by a modest wall. The evening was warm and humid, the air thick with the smell of the city, wood smoke and earth, and the faintest sweetness of temple incense drifting from the main hall. The cicadas sang their high, endless song in the trees beyond the wall. Inside the temple, the household settled into the stillness of night. Retainers found their places on the mats, arranging their swords within arm's reach, loosening the ties of their outer garments. Nobunaga retired to his quarters. The lamps were dimmed, their small flames flickering behind paper screens, casting a warm, trembling light that made the shadows on the walls seem almost alive. Yasuke settled down onto his mat, the tatami firm and cool beneath him, the weight of his swords resting beside his right hand. The temple was quiet. The city beyond the wall murmured faintly, distantly, the sounds of night in a place where thousands of lives were folding themselves into sleep. He breathed in the warm, incense-laced air, and his eyes grew heavy, and the small flame behind the nearest screen wavered once and then held steady, and the night gathered around the Honnoji like dark water filling a bowl. And somewhere outside the walls, in the lanes and roads that led toward the temple, there was movement, but it was far away, and it was quiet, and sleep came, and the night was still. Part 4. Smoke and disappearance. The smell came first. Before any sound, before any light that did not belong to the small, steady flames of the temple lamps, there was the smell. It was sharp and acrid, the unmistakable bite of something burning that was not meant to burn, not incense, not a cooking fire, but wood and thatch and lacquer catching flame in the open air. It crept into the room slowly, threading itself through the gaps in the sliding doors, mixing with the warm, still air of the sleeping quarters, and it settled into the space the way a color bleeds into water, gradually, irreversibly, changing everything it touched. Yasuke's eyes opened, not with a start, not with the sudden snap of a man jolted from sleep by danger, but with the slow, heavy confusion of someone pulled from rest by something the body recognizes before the mind does. The room was dim. The lamp behind the paper screen still burned, its small flame casting the same trembling glow it had cast when he had closed his eyes. But the air was different now. It tasted different. There was a thickness to it, a faint haze that softened the edges of the shadows on the walls and ceiling. And somewhere, at a distance that was difficult to judge in the disorientation of waking, there were sounds. They were not close. That is the important thing. They were muffled, as though the walls of the temple and the heavy night air conspired to hold them at bay, to keep them in some other, separate world beyond the quiet of the room. Voices, raised but indistinct, the words blurred into a continuous murmur that rose and fell like the sound of wind through a narrow passage. And beneath the voices, a lower sound, a crackling, steady and growing, the sound of fire finding its appetite. The Honnoji was under attack. The historical facts, stripped to their barest form, are these. Akechi Mitsuhide, one of Nobunaga's own generals, a man who had served within the Oda hierarchy for years, had turned his army against his lord. The reasons for this betrayal have been debated for over 4 centuries, and remain, even now, a thing of speculation and theory, a question that history poses but does not answer. What is known is that in the earliest hours of that June morning, Mitsuhide's forces surrounded the temple compound. Thousands of soldiers moving through the dark streets of Kyoto, with a quietness that seems almost impossible for an army, but which the element of surprise demanded. Then they closed in. But from inside the temple, from the perspective of a man rising from his sleeping mat in a room filling slowly with smoke, the scope of what was happening was invisible. There was no panoramic view, no sense of armies and strategy, and the vast, churning machinery of betrayal. There was only the immediate, the smell, the sound, the growing warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the humidity of the season and everything to do with flame. Yasuke reached for his swords. His hands found them in the dim light, the familiar weight of the scabbards, the wrapped handles settling into his grip with the certainty of long habit. He rose to his feet, and the motion felt slow, as though the air itself had thickened, as though the smoke that was now visible as a thin, drifting layer near the ceiling was pressing down on everything, compressing time, dragging each second outward into something longer and heavier than it should have been. The corridors were filling with figures, shapes in the haze, retainers and servants moving in directions that seemed uncertain, their forms made indistinct by the smoke and the low light. Paper screens glowed from behind with a light that was no longer the pale, steady light of lamps, but something warmer, more orange, more alive, the light of fire pressing against the other side of the thin paper and making it luminous. Doors were open that should not have been open. The air moved now, pulled by the heat of the flames, creating currents that tugged at the fabric of clothing and carried the smoke in shifting, unpredictable rivers through the hallways. Yasuke moved toward his lord's quarters. This much the historical fragments suggest. His duty was to Nobunaga, and in the confusion of that smoke-filled temple, duty was perhaps the only clear thing, the only line that could be followed when all other lines had been erased by the haze. The floors beneath his feet were warm, not hot, not yet, but warm in a way that wood should not be warm in the hours before dawn. And the warmth radiated upward through the soles of his feet and into his legs, mingling with the heaviness that was already there, the weight of interrupted sleep and sudden, incomprehensible danger. What he found, or what he did not find, at Nobunaga's quarters, exists in the historical record only as absence. The accounts that survive, written after the fact by men who were not present, tell us that Nobunaga understood quickly what was happening, that he recognized the banners of Mitsuhide's forces, that he spoke a few words, perhaps of resignation, perhaps of defiance. The accounts differ. And that he retreated into the interior of the burning temple and did not emerge. His end was private. It occurred behind walls of smoke and flame, in a space that no surviving witness could see into. And by the time the fire had consumed the Honnoji, there was nothing left to confirm the precise manner of his passing. He simply ceased to be present in the world, as quietly and as completely as a candle flame ceasing in a room where no one is watching. Seppuku is the word that history attaches to this moment, the act of a warrior taking his own life rather than allowing himself to be captured. It is a practice deeply embedded in the culture of the samurai, a final assertion of control in a situation where all other control has been lost. But for our purposes, in this quiet telling, it is enough to say that Nobunaga disappeared into the smoke of the Honnoji, and the smoke rose into the pale sky of early morning, and the temple burned, and the man who had unified much of Japan was gone. Yasuke emerged from the temple compound. The details of how he did so are sparse, fragments of information scattered across later accounts, like pieces of a torn page. He may have fought. The records suggest he made his way to Nobunaga's heir, Oda Nobunaga, at a nearby castle, and that he was present during the confusion that followed there as well. But the specifics dissolve into the same haze that filled the corridors of the Honnoji. And what remains is an image, a single figure moving through a city that had been overtaken by events too large for any one person to comprehend. The streets of Kyoto, normally so ordered, so quiet in their grid-like precision, were now filled with the distant sounds of an army consolidating its sudden violent authority. Smoke rose from multiple points on the skyline. The air smelled of char and damp wood, and the particular bitterness of things burned before their time. The Nanbanji was a modest building by the standards of European cathedrals, but within the context of Kyoto, it was an anomaly, a structure built in a foreign style for a foreign faith, standing quietly among the wooden temples and residences of the city. Its doors opened, and Yasuke was brought inside, and the doors closed behind him, and the sounds of the city, the distant residue of the morning's upheaval, faded to a murmur, and then to something less than a murmur, and then to silence. And so Yasuke sits in the Nanbanji, and the dust turns in the light, and the candle flames are steady and small, and somewhere outside the walls of the church, the world is remaking itself, as it always does after the collapse of powerful men. But in here it is quiet, and the wood of the bench is smooth beneath his hands, and his breathing has slowed, and the weight of the swords is a familiar and fading presence at his side, and the light moves across the floor in its patient, imperceptible way, and the morning deepens into something softer, and the sounds grow distant, and the air is still, and the record closes, and the silence is gentle, and it holds him, and it holds you, and there is nothing more to tell, and that is enough, and you can rest now, and the story is done.